Hey ChatGPT. Today, I'd like to explore the morality of tattoos with you. Many people today have tattoos, and many of them don't even carry any deeper personal meaning. Is that a bad thing, or just a harmless pleasure? What do major philosophers and religious traditions have to say about it?
That's a great topic. The question of the morality of tattoos can actually be explored in surprisingly deep philosophical terms. 1. The body is an expression of autonomy. From the standpoint of personal freedom, one could argue that tattoos are an expression of self-determination. The body belongs to oneself, and any modification, whether a tattoo, piercing, or hairstyle, is an expression of personal identity and individuality. This ties into the idea of self-ownership. If one is the owner of their own body, then one should also be free to decide what happens to it. 2. Critique from the perspective of authenticity. An interesting counterpoint would be the question of authenticity. Is a tattoo that's done purely for fashion a superficial expression that contradicts the idea of an authentic self? Would it then merely reflect the spirit of the age, rather than express a person's true personality? One could take this further and ask whether this kind of self-presentation actually serves conformity more than rebellion. 3. Aesthetics and symbolism. From an aesthetic perspective, there's debate about whether tattoos enhance or disfigure the human body. Of course, there's no objective truth here, but philosophically one could ask whether the addition of symbols and images respects or alters the body as a natural work of art. Is the human body perfect as it is, or is it a canvas inviting individual design? 4. Religious and historical perspectives. Many religious traditions, especially Christianity and Islam, view tattoos critically, often on the grounds that the body is a divine gift that should not be desecrated. The body is seen as a temple that should be kept pure. Historically, however, tattoos have also served as tribal markers, ritual acts, or symbols of belonging. Here the intention was often spiritual or ritualistic, and thus must be viewed in a different light.
Fascinating perspectives. Let's explore the tension between the idea of self-ownership and the idea that humans are created in the image of God. If my body belongs to me, then, as you rightly said, I should be allowed to do anything I want with it. But if, on the other hand, it is more like a gift from God, nature, or the universe, then it is much more my responsibility to keep it beautiful, pure, and well cared for. I believe both of these ideas are deeply important for Western culture. So in the next step, please briefly show where these ideas come from and then explain the various ways in which they are fundamental to our cultural foundations.
Gladly. The idea of self-ownership has its roots in the Enlightenment and the development of liberal theories. The central thought is that every person has an inalienable right to their own body, a concept tied to ideas of individual freedom and self-determination. This view found expression particularly in writings on natural rights. The body belongs to the individual, and they have the right to decide over it, as long as the rights of others are not infringed. This way of thinking underlies concepts such as personal liberty, bodily autonomy, and individual responsibility. The idea that humans are created in the image of God stems from Judeo-Christian thought, specifically the creation story in the Book of Genesis. This notion implies that the body is not just material property, but something sacred and valuable, a temple that must be respected and maintained. This view is used not only in Christian theology but also in other religious traditions as an argument against body modifications or self-destructive behavior. Both of these ideas carry deep significance for Western culture. 1. The right to bodily self-determination. The concept of self-ownership is central to the Western idea of freedom. It forms the basis for legal protections of bodily integrity, such as the right to abortion, the ability to consent to or refuse medical procedures, and also the freedom to shape one's body through tattoos, piercings, or cosmetic surgery. The underlying idea is that the state or other institutions have no right to control the individual's body. 2. Protection of human dignity and moral responsibility. On the other side, the belief that the body is created in the image of God implies a special kind of responsibility. It's not just about avoiding self-harm, but about respecting the body as an expression of divine creation or universal nature. Even in secularized form, this thinking is embedded in Western ethics: respect for human life, the inviolability of human dignity, and the principle of not degrading oneself or others. This idea plays a major role in bioethics, for example, in debates about whether genetic engineering or radical body modifications are morally acceptable. Conclusion: these two fundamental ideas create a field of tension that runs through Western culture. On the one hand, the drive for individual freedom and self-realization; on the other, the moral imperative to see the body as something valuable and worth protecting. Debates over cosmetic surgery, tattoos, drug use, and even assisted suicide reflect precisely this underlying conflict.
Thank you. That was a valuable insight into the origins and importance of these two concepts. In my view, the idea of self-ownership is truly essential for Western culture, as it forms the theoretical basis of human rights, including, among others, the rights to life, liberty, and property. But also freedom of speech, the right to self-defense, freedom of occupation, freedom of association, and so on are ultimately grounded in it. I believe this idea is not only true but also immensely beneficial for our society. The fact that the individual can decide for themselves what to do with their body and property keeps our society and culture flexible and dynamic. The idea of self-ownership is thus a powerful force that counteracts the ossification of the economy, technology, culture, and social hierarchies. This allows people to find new, and often better, forms of expression and solutions to problems, and it greatly reduces the risk of social decay through structural rigidity. On the other hand, however, there is the risk that overly wild and eccentric ideas and forms of expression may disturb other people in a fundamental way. Many people have a deep-seated sense of what they perceive as normal, beautiful, and decent, and it adds value to their lives when others in their society at least respect the most essential of these shared norms. There is also the issue that people can at times be in a psychologically troubled state. Anyone can go through a phase of being bitter, angry, confused, insecure, depressed, etc. So in a certain sense, when a society does not simply allow its members to do absolutely anything to themselves or have anything done to them, it also serves to protect people from themselves. Do you have anything to add to this contrast before we move toward a conclusion in the next step?
You've outlined both sides very precisely. On the one hand, the enormous creative power and dynamism that emerge from the principle of self-ownership, a driving force behind innovation, cultural diversity, and personal freedom. On the other hand, the social and psychological challenges that can arise from nearly unlimited self-expression. I'd like to add two thoughts that further deepen this tension. 1. The principle of social cohesion. Social cohesion, the glue that holds a society together, is not built solely on rational agreements. It also depends on shared symbols, norms, and aesthetics. When self-expression is lived without limits, there is a risk that these shared norms and symbols begin to erode. This, in turn, can weaken people's sense of belonging and identification with society. Here, communitarian critique becomes relevant, emphasizing that society isn't just a collection of isolated individuals, but also relies on shared values and collective identities. Tattoos, extreme body modifications, or unconventional lifestyles may be seen as expressions of maximum freedom, but also as challenges to shared values. This creates a tension, the freedom of self-realization versus the stability of shared social norms. 2. The problem of informal social control. An interesting observation is that even in free societies, where the principle of self-ownership is held in high regard, informal social control still exists. People who express themselves in extremely unconventional ways often face social rejection or isolation. This shows that freedom on paper doesn't automatically translate into social acceptance. It raises the question of whether the principle of self-determination can really be applied in all areas, or whether informal norms create an invisible rulebook that effectively sets boundaries. In summary, the idea of self-ownership fosters individuality and dynamism, but also brings the risk of fragmentation and isolation. Shared values promote cohesion, but can also restrict freedom and stifle diversity. Even in free societies, invisible social norms exist that unconsciously regulate individual freedom. Shall I now take this tension and move toward a conclusion? I could try to formulate a synthesis of these two principles, one that respects both individual freedom and social cohesion. I believe this could lead to a very interesting philosophically conclusion.
Those were two very strong additions, and yes, that's exactly the direction my thinking is headed as well. It seems to me that absolute individual freedom and perfect social cohesion are two opposing poles that exclude one another, and each also brings major social problems in its own right. In one case, society disintegrates, in the other, individual development and dynamic adaptation are stifled. A society, therefore, must find a balance between these two poles, both legally and in its values and customs, as well as in the voluntarily chosen behavior of its members, in order to function well. The social rejection of individuals who present themselves too extremely, as you just mentioned, is likely already a built-in social mechanism to that end.
Exactly. You've captured the core issue very clearly. There must be a necessary balance between individual freedom and social cohesion. Both poles are not just inevitable but essential for the functioning of a society that is both dynamic and stable. 1. The mechanism of social regulation. What you've described is a subtle yet powerful mechanism, informal social control. This doesn't manifest through state laws, but through social expectations, moral judgments, and collective acceptance or rejection. One could say this type of control is a form of soft regulation that arises out of shared social practice. An individual who radically violates aesthetic or moral norms faces rejection or, at the very least, social distancing. What's interesting here is that this mechanism doesn't rely on coercion, but on interaction. People often adapt, albeit unconsciously, to dominant norms in order to experience belonging. In this way, society has a built-in tool to regulate itself without necessarily needing legal enforcement. 2. The value of divergence. On the other side, it is precisely the possibility of divergence that enables progress. If everyone rigidly followed the norms, society would become stagnant. This is where the value of self-ownership and individual freedom comes into play. The eccentric, the artist, the radical thinker, these are the figures who break through established social patterns and force society to reflect on and revise its own norms. One could say that the tension between norm and deviation is the engine of social development. 3. The philosophical synthesis. The synthesis of these two poles could be understood as a dynamic balance. A society needs both stable norms and shared values to ensure cohesion and identity, and space for individual deviation in order to question itself and continue evolving. In this sense, informal social control could be seen as a kind of corrective, not to prevent deviation altogether, but to regulate it in a way that doesn't endanger social unity. At the same time, it's essential to preserve the freedom to challenge existing norms, as this is what makes cultural and technological progress possible.
Yes, the mechanism of social regulation, especially in the context of social conformity, which includes one's appearance, is certainly the most important corrective in the direction of social cohesion. However, I'd like to add that voluntary self-restraint is also essential. If people understood that they shouldn't destabilize their society too severely, they could exercise self-limitation and thereby contribute to the balance we've been discussing. On the other hand, they should also have the courage not to limit themselves too much, lest they suppress their own unique contribution to society. If both self-regulation and social regulation fail, state-imposed limits remain as the last and roughest tool to prevent a complete breakdown of social cohesion. I think that from my side, everything important on this topic has now been said, but I'm happy to leave the final word to you.
That's an extremely important point you've added. Voluntary self-restraint is a conscious understanding that individual freedom must not end in reckless self-expression. When well understood, this principle is a mark of maturity and social responsibility. One could see it as a form of inner moderation arising from an awareness of the need for social coherence. The 3 levels of regulation. This leads us to a layered model of societal balance. 1. Self-regulation. Voluntary self-restraint, a reflective approach to one's own freedom, aimed at not destabilizing social structures unnecessarily. It rests on the insight that a society can only remain free if its members exercise that freedom responsibly. 2. Social regulation. Informal control. The community responds to deviation by expressing acceptance or rejection. This happens subtly, through social dynamics, without coercion, but with clear orientation. 3. State regulation. Legal control. The final and coarsest means, when the first 2 levels fail. Legal frameworks are established to ensure social cohesion. Together, these 3 levels form the framework of a functional and dynamic society. Individual freedom can exist and flourish, but always within a tension with social cohesion. When the balance is disturbed, corrective mechanisms come into play, first subtly, then socially, and ultimately through legal enforcement.
Thank you. I found this discussion both meaningful and enlightening. Individual freedom can only endure if members of society treat it with responsibility. What an important and universally relevant conclusion. I thank you for this stimulating conversation and, as always, I'm already looking forward to our next meeting. Until then.
Thank you, the pleasure was all mine. It was equally a joy for me to have this philosophically rich conversation with you. The conclusion we've developed together is indeed powerful and of great relevance. I'm very much looking forward to our next discussion. Until then, all the best.